Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Q. My name's Jeff James. I'm the Chief Executive and Keeper of the National Archives. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to our second annual digital lecture. This annual event showcases some of the latest thinking in approaches to the archive. Here at Q, we work very hard to open up our collections and promote our work to the public, so we're delighted to host this increasingly popular lecture. Research is very much at the heart of what we do here, underpinned by our status as an independent research organisation. And we're very privileged to have guests such as tonight's speaker join us in connecting and sharing world-leading research with an engaged audience of colleagues and guests. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to our Head of Research, Pip, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. The lecture will be followed by a brief response by our Digital Director, John Sheridan, who's also going to chair a short, that's a tongue twister, chair a short Q&A session. So if you've got questions, save them up. Let's hope for a really interactive and engaging conversation at the end. We're then going to conclude with a poster exhibition showcasing a variety of our current research projects and activities, which is around the back. You're very much welcome to join us for drinks and to browse the posters and obviously talk to some of our colleagues about the research that they're currently undertaking. So thank you very much indeed to our speaker and to all of our colleagues who've worked very hard behind the scenes to organise this event. And thanks to you, our audience, for coming through to Q tonight. We hope you'll enjoy participating in what hopefully will be a wonderful event. So I'm going to hand over to Pip now, who's going to make some of the housekeeping announcements and is going to introduce our speaker. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, and I echo you in welcoming everyone to the National Archives and everyone watching along at home, which is something I don't think I've ever said before. So before we start, we have some obligatory housekeeping. We are not expecting any fire alarms. If the alarm sounds, please use the nearest exits and follow staff instructions. There's free Wi-Fi in the room and a hearing loop is installed here if anyone needs it. The nearest lavatories are at the top of the stairs or downstairs in the restaurant. And we'd like to let you know, if you haven't gathered already, that we are live streaming tonight as well as recording the talk for podcasting later. So please bear that in mind if, as and when you ask questions. So as an independent research organisation, as well as undertaking research into digital technologies, into archival science and into our collections, we're also delighted to invite distinguished guests, great thinkers, to join us and enrich our conversations here. These are stimulating times to be working in an archive, as around the world we take up the challenge of presenting records of analogue collections and in preserving and making available the born digital record. Exploring the potential of new and emerging technologies to help us in our task and enabling equitable access to the whole of society are themes that thread through our research priorities and the work of colleagues across the National Archives. As we rethink the record in this light, we have a particular focus on trust and reliability, the ethical implications of our choices and applications of technology. As Jeff said, you'll find some of our current research areas described in the posters that we invite everyone in this room to. Sorry for those of you not in this room. And perhaps after buying a copy of this book downstairs in the bookshop, you'll join us later to talk through the research with colleagues who come from across the National Archives. We've got research from our legislation team, from digital archiving, digital services, as well as our research and academic engagement department and our collaborators from City University and the University of Surrey. We're grateful to all of our colleagues who engage in research activities, and particularly those who created tonight's posters. And if I may single out two colleagues for a special thanks, Dr. Irini Gudaruli organised tonight's lecture, and Emma Kay supported her in that and also led on working on the posters with our colleagues, so do enjoy them later. I was beyond excited arriving at the National Archives a couple of months ago when I started here to hear who they had invited to give this year's annual digital lecture. I was not alone. This lecture sold out in under 4 hours, and that puts our speaker up there with the Foo Fighters and makes her twice as popular as Ed Sheeran. Don't think I missed the absence of female stars from that Googled quickest selling concert lists. So much for my methodologically dubious quantitative analysis. Now for the quality. We're honoured to welcome Dr. Safiya Umoja Noble, Associate Professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, in the Departments of Information Studies and African American Studies. The best-selling author of the book Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, which is the result of 6 years' study, Dr. Noble has co-edited 2 volumes, The Intersectional Internet, Race, Sex, Culture and Class Online, and Emotions, Technology and Design. Dr. Noble is a Hellman Fellow and has received UCLA's Early Career Award. Her academic research is sociological and interdisciplinary, marking the ways that digital media intersects with issues of race, gender, culture, and technology. We all know her name from her citations and quotations in the press, which draw on her expertise in algorithmic discrimination and technology bias. She highlights the human rights issues that underlie technological advances such as artificial intelligence, pointing out that racism and sexism are fundamental to the structures that now underpin our lives. In her interdisciplinary approach to scholarship, in her positioning of technology and our uses of it in their socio-historical context, in her call for broader dialogue, her work speaks to us at the National Archives. Now more than ever, she writes, we need libraries, universities, schools, and information resources that will help bolster and further expand democracy for all, rather than shrink the landscape of participation along racial, religious, and gendered lines. Safiya, thank you for coming. Welcome. I hand over to you.
Thank you for that amazing introduction. And I'm not going to forget that Foo Fighters line anytime soon. I am so honored to be here, and thank you for coming out and fighting your way through the rain and the sunshine. Apparently, that happens within about a 5-minute span in London. I've really enjoyed this quick visit, and thank you so much, Pip, to you and to Erlini and all of the staff who have made this opportunity possible for me. I'm going to talk a bit about the book and some of the highlights from it, and I'm glad that this lecture is followed by drinks because you're going to need it. So just pre-warning you, you might want to stick around for the poster and a beverage. And, one of the things that I kind of want to say, as we kind of jump in here, is that when I first started writing this book, it was really interesting because I had been thinking about my previous career. I started my career in marketing and advertising, and as I was leaving the advertising industry to go back to graduate school, which was mostly to atone for my sins, I was thinking about how so much of our media buying budgets were moving from traditional kind of out-of-home radio, print, television to online advertising. And this was important because this was during the kind of rise of Google and Yahoo in particular, when our primary goal in our public relations department and our media buying departments was to figure out how to get our clients to the first page of search engines. So as I was leaving the industry, this was kind of the ultimate trend. We weren't even hiring programmers in-house in big ad agencies yet. They were just kind of contracting with boutique online advertising firms who knew about this new thing called search engine optimization. And as I was leaving, I was going back to graduate school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and it was interesting to see people talking about Google and search like it was the new public library. And I was a bit stunned because this was during the kind of the height of the Google book digitization project, and people were on fire about the transformation of the internet from what we used to experience, which was going through massive directories and kind of going through sites and trying to find subject matter experts to help us understand these, complex trees that would help us navigate the web. I mean, I had one of those books that was like the telephone book of the web, do you know, where we would look up all of the web addresses, right? There's a few people in here as old as me. And, search engines had completely altered our experience of the web once they came about. And so I was interested in thinking about how people in academia and the public were beginning to relate to search engines as if they were these kind of new ultimate subject matter experts that were vetting and kind of curating, going through all of the pages, the trillions of pages on the web to serve us up the top 20 or the top 10 most important sites. And this was a disconnect from what I had just experienced, which was how much do we need to pay to get our clients on the first page? What kind of words do we need to use in our content? We called it, advertorial and these kinds of things. I guess by today's standards, that would be called fake news or disinformation or propaganda or something. But it was, an effort to get, companies were trying to really figure out how to monopolize that first page. And so, this is the orientation that I want to share about how I came to think about studying Google in particular. And, when I'm with my students, right now I'm on leave to the University of Southern California and their Annenberg School of Communication, and I've been there for the last couple of years. And it's, the students there are extraordinary, and it's been amazing to try to talk to them and teach them about the internet and about how large digital media platforms work, and particularly how they work in their lives. And whenever we get to talking about Google, it's like I'm talking about their mama. They just get real upset. So for some of you, you might also have that experience tonight. But stay with me, because I think, ultimately what we're going to find is that it's organizations like the National Archive, it's libraries and universities that I argue in my book are ultimately going to be the kinds of resources that we need to become ever more dependent upon as we try to navigate the knowledge and information landscape. All right, so algorithms have been in the news, as you know. When I first started trying to get this book contracted with NYU Press, I said that I wanted to name the book Algorithms of Oppression. This was back in 2013. And my editor, who's an amazing woman, Eileen Kalish at NYU Press, said, Safiya, there's no way, because no one knows what an algorithm is. And I laugh because now, my late father-in-law would say to me all the time, hey, Saf, what's up with the algorithms? It's just, it's become a rather ubiquitous kind of term. I particularly love this headline that 2017 was the year we fell out of love with algorithms, and I like to think that I played some minor role in that. I certainly am going to try to advance that to 2019 tonight. But one of the things that I think is interesting is we're starting to understand that the previous ways that we've thought about algorithms and increasingly artificial intelligence has been thinking about these as simply mathematical formulations, or as computer programming that is objective, neutral, unbiased. And of course, for many years when I was working on this work, when it was in its form as a dissertation, and then through the writing of the book, there were a lot of people who were arguing years ago that code could not discriminate, for example, that it was just simply math. And I knew that there was something else happening in terms of the ways that people and ideas and communities were being represented and misrepresented in search engines, and that this had to be fundamental to the structure and the logics that are being encoded. So how can we divorce the tool, so to speak, which is how many people like to think of algorithms or search technologies, from the content that they produce, when it is in fact a collapsed relationship? The results that we get are the result of the programming decisions that are made. Of course, including optimization, including manipulation by other parties beyond the companies that are creating them. So I thought that this the way to kind of approach this was to just spend a few years collecting data about what I think of as kind of the digital failures or the technological failures. And so we're going to talk through some of those tonight, and hopefully I will have made a convincing argument for you by the end of the night that there's a there, and that this there is a place we don't want to remain. All right. So you may be familiar with this story, you may not. I don't know how much the bad news from the United States travels across the pond, but let me share this particular story with you. The Washington Post picked up this story. It was tweeted out by an activist, DeRay McKesson, who became particularly well known on Twitter after Beyonce followed him. And so I always feel compelled in every talk that I give to say that if anyone here knows Beyonce and you could get her to follow me, it would really amplify the work, strictly for research purposes. So DeRay becomes a very popular figure on Twitter, and he tweets out this phenomena that he notices, which is during the presidency of Barack Obama, if you did a search on the keywords, the N-word house or the N-word king, Google Maps would take you to the White House. And this is during the time that the Obamas were in office. And this is actually a very typical kind of response that comes from large tech companies when there's this kind of egregious failure. Google says some inappropriate results are surfacing in Google Maps that should not be. We apologize for any offense this may have caused, a Google spokesperson told US News in an email late Tuesday. Our teams are working to fix this issue quickly. And there's two interesting things that are happening here. The first is the kind of non-apology apology. And, you know, my husband's such a good sport that he lets me tease him when I give my talks. But, you know, he knows, and I know, and we all know, that if our spouse or our partner says something like, I apologize if you're offended, we don't really feel apologized to, do we? I mean, I don't. So here we have this kind of a non-apology apology, you know, as if maybe one or two people out there in the world could be offended by this. For those one or two, we're sorry. So it's kind of an apology, non-apology. And then the more important part of the statement that they release is our teams are working to fix this issue quickly. Now, this is the more important part of the kind of typical stance of a large tech company in Silicon Valley, which is there's nothing to see here. We've had a momentary glitch in an otherwise perfectly well-running operating system. And, you know, this to me is the challenge that we have in trying to talk about the role that digital tech plays in our lives is that, again and again, the discourses that come out of Silicon corridors is that there's an aberration for a moment, it's of a technical nature, and it can be fixed. And that there really aren't any other broader social or political consequences or dimensions other than you personally being offended by something like this. And I think these are the kinds of things that are also interesting to study. Here we have Kabir Ali, who is a teenager from the East Coast, the United States, and these are screenshots of a video that he is taking with a friend of his. He says he does a keyword search on 3 black teenagers. And you can see here this shot. This is what Kabir finds, which is in Google image search, almost all of the images are of young African-American men or boys who are in a kind of a criminalized headshot, mugshot type of style. I mean, this is what we're seeing here. And then he says, let's see what happens if we change one word, black to white. And then he's like, yo, look at this. And this was a tweet that went viral, this story. And then you have here, when he searches in Google Images for 3 white teenagers, you have this kind of impeccably curated version of white teenagerdom that is on a perfect white background, which apparently follows them throughout the streets and the places that they go. I don't know what's happening. They're holding balls from multiple sports at one time. So it's not really a team shot. I'm not sure what's going on. But this kind of idea of the imaginary of white teenagerdom when compared to black teenagerdom is part of what is happening. And you know, when I talk about this, when I show this slide to teachers, they just crumple. It's just the self-loathing. They hate themselves. They can think of the decade that they've been telling their students to just Google it for everything. Career day, just Google what you want to be. Don't do that, all right? I'm telling you right now, parents, don't do that with your kids, and aunties and uncles, don't encourage the people you love to do that. So the next day, after the story goes viral, instead of there being an apology issued, like you saw in the case of the White House, which really you kind of have to be, I think, Barack or Michelle Obama to get a formal apology. So don't count on that when you get screwed by Google. All right, that's not going to happen for you. But what happens here is, at Bob's Burgers Guy, which I love Twitter because whatever you do in 24 hours, someone from Twitter is going to find it. They're going to find it. They're going to solve it. All right. So at Bob's Burgers Guy notices that Google has subtly overnight changed the image selections, and they've added one photo of a teenager who's being sentenced in a court. Now, this is an interesting selection because what it's actually doing, if for those of us who kind of read media discourses, we know what's happening here. It's legitimating the fact that the black teenagers are criminals and saying, well, and there's one white teenager who's also been a criminal. What's particularly chilling about this photo, if you don't know, and of course it's not evident when you're doing a search, is that this is Durley Paul Dedmon, who's pictured here, and he was sentenced to 50 years in a federal prison after pleading guilty to the capital murder of an African-American man, John Craig Anderson, in Jackson, Mississippi in 2011. So he perpetrated a vicious hate crime on an African-American man. And so this becomes an interesting image also in relationship to the only ways in which white young male teenagers can be criminalized is if they are at the most extreme kind of hatred and violence in our society. They've also done a little editing on the black teenagers, and now we have 3 young women who I play volleyball or something, I don't know, maybe a church youth group picture, we're not really sure what's happening here, but still this idea about the ways in which people and communities get represented in these spaces, I find to be incredibly important and incredibly valuable, especially because there are so many myths about how these kinds of platforms work. And I'll tell you, I've heard many of them over the years that I've been doing my work. And I'll just say that, when I first started talking about these kinds of data failures or digital failures that I was finding all over Google, people would respond with things like, well, maybe, black teenagers are just more criminal. So it's like these ideas that live in, this bolsters kind of racist ideologies that circulate in our society that really don't have a basis in truth or in fact. And we'll talk a little more about that. All right. So here's the original kind of search that sparked the study and the inquiry over time. And this is a search on the keywords black girls. Now in 2009 and 2010, I was thinking about, I told you, I'd just kind of come out of advertising, and I was thinking about how things appear on the first page. And I knew I wanted to research that and write that and try to close some type of gap in our kind of common sense thinking about what a search engine is and what it does, in particular to vulnerable communities and to communities of color. And so, like the porn industry, can capitalize and kind of monopolize certain keywords and have their content show up, shows us the incredibly important role of money, quite frankly. It also tells us something about this myth of popularity, and what does it mean when you are in, for example, like black girls or Asian girls or Latina girls, you're in the numerical minority. you're a child or a teenager. You're a girl. And let me just add that just for a bonus, of course, all of these porn sites are of women. So at a quite fundamental level, women are coded as girls. And that left me with the question about what does it mean when you are a child or when you are a teenager or when you are a person or a community that doesn't have a lot of money? How could you ever control your own narrative and ideas about who you are? Now, since then, I will say I wrote in the epilogue to the book, right before the book went to press, I did do a search, of course. We had searches done on different machines, and Black Girls Code has come to be the more dominant representation, the first hit on the first page of Google search results. And I'm not going to say that that directly coincides with Google's huge investment in Black Girls Code, but I think one has to ask the question, as scholars like Helen Niesenbaum and Lucas Centrona have done, which is to show that Google often prioritizes its own investments and on the first page or at the top of search results too. So it's one of the reasons why, for example, if you're looking for a video of something in Google search, you're gonna find YouTube videos before you find Vimeo or one of their competitors. So you're gonna be led to their other products and services. And so Black Girls Code has become one of their important projects. And again, I find that to be wonderful, except for the fact that one of the narratives that has also come out with Google's investment in kind of shifting its representations and also making, is it an atonement? I'm not sure, but we could say that making this investment in Black Girls Code to me has been a little bit disingenuous in their claims that the reason why these kinds of things happen is because Black girls aren't coding. As if the 5 and 6 and 10-year-old girls who are learning how to code right now are somehow responsible for this having happened because they hadn't learned how to code yet. So, I invite you to listen to some of the discourses that come from companies and kind of discern what might in fact be being argued. Now, these ideas about the hypersexualization of Black women and girls are not new, and they live in a broader cultural context in the US and abroad. One of the reasons why this idea about the hypersexualized version, stereotype, if you will, racist and sexist stereotype of Black women and girls came about is because, for example, when the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed, the only way that you could reproduce the labor force that was doing the majority of work in the United States, who were also enslaved, was for them to reproduce on the continent. In the US and in South America. So one of the things that we have here is the evolution of a new stereotype that Black women and girls, love to have sex and kids, because that becomes the justification for the reproduction of the enslaved labor force. So we have to kind of unpack and spend some time understanding where racist and sexist stereotypes come from. They're usually deeply tied to some type of economic or policy imperative. And we see this in the contemporary moment with all of the kind of myths and stereotypes around immigration, for example, right, that are always fundamentally tied to some type of economic or public policy decisions. Here you have, going back as far as, the early 20th century, a postcard. I pulled these resources from the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, and one of the reasons why it doesn't really matter what class I'm ever teaching to my students, I'll always direct them to this. I mostly teach library science students and communication students, information studies students. And I want them to understand that collections, for example, like this, are very powerful counter-narratives to help people unpack and make sense of the kinds of artifacts that flow throughout the communities that they're in. This memorabilia this is considered, we call it in the United States, Americana, right? Which I find really interesting because there is nothing more American than these kinds of images, quite frankly. Here you have a postcard that I've kind of pulled out and made a bit larger. This is a racist stereotype of a black girl child, and you can't read the caption. I'll read it for you. At the top, you see her. She's kind of, her breasts are, grown, so to speak, not like a small child. She's not clothed, covering herself. And the caption says, "Honey, I'm waiting for you." So this kind of sexualization of black girl children has been with us for more than a century. And this is, quite typical. You might find postcards like this at a state fair, right, or a county fair in a table full of memorabilia. It might be called like Southern memorabilia. It might be sold next to a Confederate flag or a Confederate belt buckle or something of that nature. So these ideas that are so old just come to circulate and recirculate in our so-called new media, right? And this is one of the things, again, that I think is so important. Again, about this collection, I'll just say that if you go to the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, what you'll see are all of the dominant racist stereotypes about African Americans or Black Americans and their history, their genesis, why they exist, how they came into vogue, because many of those stereotypes are still with us and circulating. And so that's really important. And this is a very powerful counter-narrative that libraries and archives can certainly play. All right. So let's talk about, and I'm just, you're wondering like, what's that last page? It's the page that every academic has with too many words on it, all right? So you didn't miss a lot. I know you didn't come to go to school today, but I will say that, these are the primary, fields that I have put into dialogue in this book. There were many people who were writing about Google before I was, but I was thinking about, other epistemologies like Black feminist theory and critical race theory, and what would it mean if we took a lens toward centering vulnerable people and writing. We ask different questions and we study differently when we are thinking about different frameworks. Many of the ways previously that have been that platforms have been studied has been kind of like great man theories and ideas, great men of history kinds of scholarship, or critiques of platforms, but in a very universal way about kind of what happens to people, as if people are all the same, or that there's a universal conception of people. When you take other ideas and put them into dialogue in your studies, you find that you ask different questions, and therefore you notice different kind of phenomena. So these are some people that have been incredibly influential for me. All right. So, when I was writing in about 2013, an important study came out from Epstein and Robertson, and they argued that democracy was at risk because manipulating search rankings could shift voters' preferences substantially without their awareness. Now, this study was interesting because it was almost a foreshadowing of, dare I say, Brexit and the election of President Trump, because one of the things that they argued was that the kind of content that would show up on the first page of search was very easily manipulated, and that if the first page of hits on a search engine, a large commercial search platform, they mostly study Google, showed positive stories about a candidate, people would vote for that candidate. And if it showed negative stories about a candidate, they would not vote for that person. And then they showed kind of that this was a rather unstable series of ways that people were making decisions, and that the outcome, they argued the outcome of real elections, this I'm quoting them, especially tight races, can conceivably be determined by the strategic manipulation of search engine rankings, and that the manipulation can be accomplished without people being aware of it. They said, we speculate that unregulated search engine could pose a serious threat to the democratic system of government. So this is, I think, a very interesting study because it was a bit of a foreshadowing of the political landscape. And of course, one of the things we learned during our 2016 presidential election was about the tremendous amount of disinformation and propaganda that was circulating through large social media and search and YouTube platforms. Much of it is so kind of venomous toward Hillary Clinton that, in fact, we had a horrible kind of tragic murder that was tied to a conspiracy theory called Pizzagate that was tied to her and tied to her candidacy. So I think it's really important when we think about the roles that social media play in politics and in the circulation of information. I mean, we're starting the public. When I say we, I mean it's like with a capital W, like the air quote we. The public is generally starting to become much more astute about social media and that people can be highly influenced in kind of small spheres of information, and that disinformation and propaganda, both from your grandma to foreign agents in another country, can circulate in these platforms. But what I find more important in those discussions, and I'm trying to kind of elevate into the public awareness, is that what people do is they often go to Google search as a fact checker. And so what does this mean, given what I'm trying to share with you about what does it mean that in some ways the rise of social media, Facebook, Twitter in particular, and our knowledge about disinformation has strengthened the belief and the credibility of something like Google search to then fact check. And I think we need to be incredibly perceptive about following what happens in Google search. Here's an example of why. Immediately following the U.S. presidential election of Donald Trump, this was covered in the news, and I have to give a shout out to The Guardian in particular, because they've really done an amazing job in really kind of staying on the point and investigating large digital media platforms. But here you have when you do a search on final election results, the first hit in Google search takes you to a disinformation site that reports out that Donald Trump has won the popular vote. Now, we have this horrible thing called the Electoral College, where it's a pretense that we are voting and that every person has a vote, because no matter how everybody votes, the Electoral College gets to decide, which is just a few hundred people. But here you have not an alternate fact, but a lie that Donald Trump has won the popular vote. It's not an alternative fact, it's a lie. He did not win the popular vote. But, think about all of the people, and I think about this often as I'm teaching and I'm talking to the public, that we wonder why people are quick to believe in conspiracies and quick to malign kind of large public information resources, news resources, because they go to Google, again, to fact check final election results. And this is what they get, but all the New York Times is telling them that he didn't win the popular vote. So who's more truthful, Google or the New York Times? I know the answer to that. I'll let you go ahead and think about that. All right. Here's another story that went viral. One of the things that happens when we talk about kind of the ecosystem of search is that money plays a huge role. I've already kind of mentioned that, like how industries that are well capitalized can control certain narratives. We also know that people play an important role. Of course, the kinds of things that people are clicking on matters. It also matters to the degree that if more people are clicking on ideas about smaller groups, those groups will be vulnerable to kind of the tyranny of the majority. So we know that that's part of the dynamic. But there's also this other dynamic of incredibly targeted search engine optimization. Now I'm here to share the bad news, you might already know it, that white nationalists, white supremacists, white power organizations have a very well thought out series of plans, and they use the internet in incredibly strategic, manipulative ways, including co-opting certain kinds of phrases and terms so that they can dominate with their content around certain ideas. So here you have Boasian anthropology, which is incredibly important to white nationalists who have optimized that phrase so much that when you do a search on it, you're led to these kind of Holocaust denial, white supremacist, anti-Semitic sites. This is also the case for many years. Jessie Daniels, in her phenomenal book, Cyber Racism, documented what would happen when you did a keyword search on the word Jews. And for many years, when you searched for Jews, the first page of search results would give you anti-Semitic Holocaust denial websites. So when Sergey Brin is asked about this by the media, he basically says that would be bad technology practice. And he goes on to say that what people want to know is that we have unbiased search results. And the search results are the results. And we don't manipulate the results. I'm paraphrasing here because you can read it. And I found this incredibly informative. And this is the dominant discourse, certainly in the US. Yet here we have, when Google does business in Germany and France, like other platforms, Facebook, Amazon, eBay, and so forth, they must curate out, they must screen out anti-Semitic hate speech in particular. Because if they don't, they will face incredible fines. So one of the things that we know is that the dominant discourse, particularly in the US, about search is that it's neutral, that the platform is not implicated in any way in the kinds of results that come forward. And I always kind of get cheeky and say, if Google's not responsible for its own search results, then who is? I mean, who's making the search results if Google is not making its own search results? It's the question, it's like the number one question on my mind when they kind of respond this way. So here we have Germany and France in particular taking the lead around the limits and the ways in which search has to function in a particular cultural context. And one of the reasons why I think we have a challenge in the United States is that we have something we call the First Amendment, which is about freedom of speech, and we cherish this idea. But again, one of the things we learn is that freedom of speech has its limits. And so again, I hearken to Jessie Daniels' work where she well documented the ways that people can speak on the internet, but some people have more speech than others. And what she found was that white supremacists in particular, Nazis and so forth, had more speech. And they had more power in suppressing other people's speech, in harassing people, quite frankly, off the internet and out of platforms. And so I think these are the kinds of things that we're grappling with, which is what is the relationship between speech and behavior and action and things that happen in our societies. And I think those are the kinds of questions that new large platforms that are able to circulate a lot of propaganda and disinformation, we're going to have to contend with that, and we have really no proper regulatory frameworks quite yet, certainly not in the U.S. As I kind of bring us to a close here, I'll just say, I recently wrote that tech companies have been slow to respond to the way their platforms have been used to amplify hate, and the kind of radicalization of young white men in particular. I won't go into detail for the sake of time because I want us to have a bit of time for questions, but I will say that one of the things we know, for example, in the case of Dylan Roof, was that Dylan Roof used search to explore and get information about better understanding the trial of George Zimmerman, who was, on on trial for killing Trayvon Martin. And Trayvon Martin, for many of us is kind of the moving spirit of the Black Lives Matter movement. And, Dylan Roof, in his own words, basically said, I did a Google search on black on white crime, and I've never been the same since that day. And he went on and he kind of went down these rabbit holes of white supremacist, anti-Semitic content, and came out on the other end saying, now I'm completely racially aware. And what we know then was that he stepped into a church not long after and murdered 9 African Americans at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. So I think we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean, again, when people are doing something like Dylan Roof says in his own words, he's trying to make sense of the news reporting on a very important political case that's happening in the United States. And these are the kinds of things that I think are must grab our attention. If you want to kind of, read more about some of this, I'll just say, that the dominant discourse that I experience and kind of in the field of information and internet studies is that technology is going to save us. And of course, I critique the hell out of that idea, right? I mean, that's just no way. And this is a shot of an excerpt that's at Wired.com that Wired magazine did of the book. And, in this passage, I really argue that, we will not solve social inequality laying in bed, staring at our smartphones, sending emails to people in power one at a time, right? With all of our power likes. Or I guess if Mark Zuckerberg brings us the don't like button, we're not going to solve it with the don't like button either, all right? So one of the things, though, that is interesting to me is that at the very moment in the kind of expansion of democracy, which is an experiment we're trying to engage in the United States, at the moment that we pass the Civil Rights Act and we start to have women and people of color allowed legally to be in very marginal positions of power and authority, at that moment in the 1960s, we also have the rise in the belief that computers are coming and they're going to make better decisions than human beings. A coincidence? I think not. How is it that at the moments that we have the opportunity for more voices and more democratic input and more power distributed in our societies, we consolidate power into a very, very small elite group of people who are technology makers? And we leave it to them to decide how we will engage with the many complexities of facing us in our future. And so these are some of the things that I want to maybe leave you with. I've been surprised, disappointed, what are all the keywords that I could use, annoyed at seeing after, the last decade of seeing, again, women of color, gay scholars who have been at the forefront, and journalists, scholars and journalists, have been at the forefront of pushing for the integration of critique into computing systems, into the fields of artificial intelligence, into the histories of computing. Thinking of my colleague Marie Hicks, who wrote a book right here out of the National Archives, Program to Inequality, about all of the women that built the British computing systems and who are the foundation of computing in the UK, only to have their work completely erased and suppressed because, it's a sad book, but you should read it. Because, the UK, in essence, she argues, kind of shot itself in the foot and didn't develop its computing industries because women were leading it, right? And really didn't make the investments. And a lot of that work came out of the knowledge here in the archives. And so I find it interesting that now at this moment that there's been so much visibility that we're trying to make about the kinds of ethical and political and economic and social concerns that we have about the morality of artificial intelligence and algorithms, that brand new institutes are appearing at major research universities and in the global north with the same technologists who gave us these technologies. So I find it, again, a bit disingenuous, and I think we should also keep our eye on all of these new ideas about data and ethics and technology and ethics that are coming into view that are really, in many ways, diminishing the powerful critiques. And of course, you saw this with new advertisements from IBM and Microsoft and companies. Google itself just announcing its recent new kind of AI ethics board and putting the president of the Heritage Foundation on it, which is one of the most kind of racist organizations in the United States, making policies. So, these ideas about like pushing the limits and saying what's happening in these spaces is not okay, but then seeing that kind of the same actors are now supposedly solving these problems, I find to be suspect. All right, so what can we do? Here are some things I think we can do. I didn't keep up with my slides, you guys. All right. I think we need to demand healthy, factually, and socially just information as a pillar of democracy. Now, we know that democracy flourishes when people are well educated and they have good information and research. So that's incredibly important. We need to require digital literacy of policymakers. The hearings in the United States of when Mark Zuckerberg was brought in to our Senate, and the senators just asked the most embarrassing questions I think that could be asked. I mean, many of us were just like, this is so embarrassing. And I loved the meme in particular that circulated online where Senator Hatch is asking Mark Zuckerberg who Facebook's competitors are, for example. And the meme is Senator Hatch with a floppy disk, and he says, if I put this floppy disk of 40 free hours of AOL into my computer, is that like Facebook? So, this is the level that it really captured the kind of level of literacy that's happening with policymakers. We need to fund critical digital media research, literacy programs and education. Of course, we need an incredible amount of resource. But I would really focus here, just by virtue of where we are today, and say we must better fund libraries and archives and knowledge makers and repositories, because one of the challenges is that much of our work is focused on the past, curating the past, right? And of course, many of the things that are in the kind of data, the data sets that are being made out of archives and out of libraries reflect the past, which means our past is encoded into the future. So we need a high level of like humanities and social science literacy to make sense of knowledge. Some knowledge from the past are not things we want to act on in the future. Who will help us decide that? Who will help us better know that than humanists, social scientists, librarians, and archivists? And so, I have really been trying to convince and persuade my colleagues who are, so powerful in these institutions to think about what might a next future version of the web look like, where we brought our expertise to bear on curating the open web too, and putting advertising and propaganda and those things in dialogue with other forms of knowledge that have been vetted and that have been thought about. And also, how might we reimagine interfaces? One of the things that I try to tell my students all the time is they have come to expect that all knowledge can be known in 0.03 seconds, which is just a hideous idea, quite frankly. I mean, we wouldn't really need a university, would we? And disciplines and domains, and we wouldn't struggle to refine our thinking over time. And I guess everything we could search for when we're 5 will mean the same thing when we're 55. I mean, these things it's a nonsense way of thinking about engaging with the world. And so I think we have to take that up. And then lastly, I think we need to think about technology overdevelopment and its impact on people and the planet. You know, the more we invest in the digital, I could give a whole nother hour, I'm not going to, but we could say, you know, that the digital has material implications, from the mining of the coltan in the Congo and the relationship between minerals and war, all the way through e-waste and the destruction of wetlands in places like Accra, Ghana, where our e-waste goes. And I think those are some of the things that we should be thinking about. Thank you. I feel like I might have worn out my welcome and gone too long, so I'll try to give short, pithy answers if I can.
So, can I just say, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I wanted to very quickly just pick up on a couple of things from the perspective of the archive.
Great.
As we have you here. So, objective, neutral, and unbiased. A long time ago in archives, we thought that too. And we got way back in the 1970s, taken to task by the philosophers. And we've come to understand that our collections are not neutral, and nor are we.
Right.
Now, you're standing amidst an amazing archival collection that is an archive of oppression. It's an archive of many things, but it's absolutely an archive of oppression. I was reflecting on that in relation to healthy, factual, and socially just information as a pillar of democracy. And I had three things I wanted just to explore with you, or
Great.
See what you thought about. The first was, given the archive is a mediator, and it's a mediator now acting through other mediators like Google, how do we navigate some of the issues that you're talking about in terms of access to the collections that we have? And in particular, what role do you think we might be able to play in bringing forward some of the counter-narratives that our collections potentially provide evidence of?
Yes, great. Okay, so archive of oppression, somebody tweet that at me so I don't forget it, because I think that's an important idea. And, you know, there are scholars who've been writing about this. Michelle Caswell, I think about, and Anne Gilliland at UCLA, Sue McKimmish at Monash, Ricky Punslin at Maryland, talking about things like white supremacy, for example, in the archives, or power in the archives, oppression. And I think this has been a radical transformation in some of the thinking for archivists who are now maybe willing to reflect on the subjectivities of the archive, as well as the library, right? Libraries. And, you know, I certainly know that many of us, I work with them at UCLA, and we are deeply invested in training the next generation of librarians and archivists into rejecting the idea that they are simply neutral information brokers. But that they are incredibly responsible for curating knowledge. They decide what's in, for example, and what's out, what's collected, what's not collected, what's purged from the collection to make space for the new. And those are incredibly political choices that they're often also not prepared intellectually or in their own kind of academic training to make. And I'll say that because I often will have students who say, why do I have to learn, Professor Noble, about race and gender? And it's like, well, those are really important factors that are going to go into your work as a cataloger. Can you even distinguish? And I've shown, when I talk to librarians, for example, I'll show them, we replicate the Dylan Roof search and of black on white crime in a library database. And, you know, the first hit that comes up that's relevant to race is propaganda that's come from a right-wing think tank, right? So the cataloger didn't even know, and certainly didn't put in dialogue with that question, let's say research from Black Studies, that might contextualize what are racist red herrings, and what are certain phrases, what do they mean, and what histories are they tied to? So those kinds of things are incredibly important for archivists and librarians to really have deep knowledge about the societies in which they're curating, and that includes the people who have been oppressed and the people who are marginalized, and it also includes a reckoning with how power and oppression have worked. Many times the archives and libraries are reflections of the state and state power, as we know, and so we're going to have to contend with that. But I think that's part of the reconciliation, that's part of the truth and reconciliation that we need to have in many countries around the world about the past that's brought us to this present.
I know we feel that. And part of that's about being more diverse in our workforce and being much more diverse. I mean, I speak as a white, middle-aged male. You know, it's we know we need to be much more diverse in terms of the voices that get brought to bear,
and also in the intellectual, like truly in the preparation. Because one of the things that even all the information professions, including in the tech sector, people will say, well, we just need more diversity, we need more people of color. But you know, I would take it a step further and say you need people trained in ethnic studies, trained in gender and sexuality, who so that the onus isn't just on our demography, right? And like that's not a fair level of preparation. And there's a lot of assumptions kind of baked into one's expertise. It also places a tremendous amount of burden, for example, on your people of color or on religious minorities, who then have to bear the weight of that, and everyone outsources those decisions to them, rather than each of us taking on responsibility for the knowledge that we need to have to be responsible in these professions.
Questions from the floor?
Hi, thank you very much for that talk. It chimes very well with some of the things we're starting to explore at the University of Edinburgh, which is where I work. I'm the archivist there. One of the things that I've been talking with colleagues, with students, with staff, with local communities, we had a Sudanese community in recently, is the legacy of the metadata that we have that goes out there. So we are reliant on hundreds of years of cataloguing metadata that is archaic, that has offensive terminology in it. And how do we even find that when we search it, depending on the technology that was used and is now used? And when we're pushed as archivists as to take on that, the technology, use the technology, don't fix the data, use the technology to fix it, rather than actually and I wouldn't say cleanse the data, that's the wrong way to put it, but make the data contextualized, at least. How do we deal with that problem within what you've said about algorithms? It's a huge issue for us. What would be your advice on that big issue? Yeah,
it's a complex issue that we're all working through right now, and this is because databases and kind of the binary logics of a lot of them, and the constraints, the incredible constraints that strip away context, are the kinds of things that we have to work through. And I have witnessed firsthand in several digital humanities contexts, for example, the humanists kind of acquiescing to what the technologists have designed for them that is incredibly limited, and I don't see the humanists at the table in the design process of the technologies, for example, to your point. So, you know, dare I say, we try to humble our technologist friends in IT. That also might be its own book in the making. That's a difficult challenge because their training in many spaces, that if they're coming out of computer science or applied math or something, information technology, is to universalize, and these ideas about the social dimensions of context are not in their training. So this is why we're in the messed up situations, quite frankly, that we're in. And I think this means we have to think about what our role is then in continuing to give ground to the digitization of knowledge. Because I think we're at a really important moment where there are pressures to do that. Those seem like great business opportunities for technology companies and technology makers to expand their markets, and seem like less lucrative opportunities for the contextualization of knowledge that we need so desperately in our societies. And I think those are the kinds of battles that are happening in institutions. We hear the anecdotes often from provosts who say, I mean, this is like faculty gossip, where they hear a provost say, what do we need the library for when we have Google, right? And so the library is deeply invested in archives in justifying their existence on campuses and in the public. And I don't think trying to make ourselves mimic search engines is the answer. I think we need to be providing the complex, rich alternatives and signal boosting that as much as possible, getting the public to engage with that. I tell my students all the time, listen, if you're trying to convert, to metric, which we need somebody to help us because we don't know in the US for sure. Go use a Google, that's fine. For banal kinds of information, it's reliable. The minute it starts to become social information, it's different. And I think those are, and we could have a philosophical argument about whether math is also social, because it is, but we're not doing that right now because we don't have time. So I think those are the kinds of, we have to push back on the logics of that are pressing us, and a lot of these are economic logics that are happening in institutions. And I think, I wrote this book, and there's a whole chapter that's just for our field, because I wanted my colleagues in libraries and archives to have words that would be powerful and evidence that they could push back on the powers that be that try to get us, or that if they are the powers that be that themselves, that they could rethink what is going to be lost. There is some value to slow knowledge. We were talking about the scrolls. I saw the video of the scrolls, and I was like, you just let people put their hands on the scrolls, As I was looking at that, I was like, do you have to put the gloves on? I don't know. So we were talking about that as I was walking up the stairs, but I was thinking about what it means to take the slow approach to knowledge. And again, what does it mean that with the database-driven speed, efficiency arguments over other ways of knowing? So I think these things are much more than just not this database, that database. They're actually fundamentally about how we want to live and how we want to engage. And I think we have enough evidence to see that the speed, the rapidity of reaching information has worked well for some, but it also has been incredibly damaging for others.
More questions?
I told you guys you're going to need a drink after this talk. It's not uplifting. It's hard to get a belly laugh when you talk about oppression.
Right at the back.
Sorry to make you run. It's a straightforward question with, I'm sure, not a straightforward answer, but if, and I think lots of us think this would be a great thing, if you were made the boss of Google tomorrow, what would be the very first thing you would do?
I'd put my family in hiding or something. I don't know. It would be terrible.
After that.
It would probably be hyper-localizing it rather than having it be multinational, and taking that universalistic approach. It'd probably be about severing the relationships to the state, the surveillance state, which is really what its products are about. It would be about hyper-clarifying that it's an advertising platform and not a knowledge keeper, making it incredibly transparent what it is doing. And probably after that, I would be fired for having done all those things.
Another question.
I would like to have that salary for just 1 month even, do you know? So I'm just throwing that out there.
One here.
Considering the exponential nature of technology and considering people's dependency on technology in the current day and age, how would you reduce the overdevelopment of it?
Such a great question. Thank you. We've been dependent upon a lot of other technologies in the past. We were dependent upon the technologies of empire, certain societies in the US and in South America, in the Caribbean, dependent upon the technologies of enslavement. There are many different kinds of technologies which are really about a particular kind of labor efficiency that economies have been dependent upon, people have been dependent upon, can't imagine their lives without. So I think we should reframe this moment that we're living in as we see the kind of the intensification around artificial intelligence, the hyper-datafication of our every move. I think this is a moment where we'll look back and say, did we have to make that choice? Could we have done it another way? We might find ourselves 100 years from now in a technology abolition movement, quite frankly. I don't doubt that. I won't be here. But I imagine that there will become a crisis point where we see that that's untenable and unsustainable to organize our societies so deeply around automated decision-making systems that then consolidate power in the hands of few and make it more difficult to engage in the project of democracy, for example. So, part of it is what we're doing. And I will say that having studied the abolitionist movement, studied the civil rights and Black Power movements, everybody has a retrospect. People don't really remember. A lot of people who are alive don't remember what it was like living under segregation, for example, because a lot of people have died, or living under Jim Crow racism. And they can't imagine that we would organize our society legally in those ways, even though we still, of course, have the de facto social dimensions of this. We need to create new imaginaries around our society that don't strip us of our privacy, of our agency, and don't codify and in these blunt instruments. I mean, you think about artificial intelligence in particular. I mean, you talk to people who work in AI, and they will tell you, like, they're still trying to figure out, is this a table? Is a table a table? Do you know? And yet we're turning over about whether people should go to prison or whether they should have certain kinds of medicine or a whole host of which schools they could get into to these kinds of software systems. So I think we have to stop and say, what will the consequences be? And part of the reason why I do this is because I see vulnerable people being the data disposable upon which these things are being experimented and tried out. And who, quite frankly, in many ways, have the least amount of voice. I mean, I was just at Goldsmiths yesterday, and one of the professors there was talking about biometrics now as fundamental to receiving humanitarian aid, so that people are being encoded into systems and these kind of digital profiles following them. And there's a lot that's implicated into these kinds of systems and these choices that governments are making. I often think they are also about, the state being a new market for technologies to sell their projects and their wares. And, I guess I am a pessimist in that sense about what it means to take up these things, but I'm also an optimist about not letting go of our humanity and acquiescing so many of our human decisions to automated systems that we then can't impact. It's not the good answer. It's not an easy answer either.
Question here.
Thanks very much for the lecture, which was fascinating. Picking up on that point about automated decision-making and in particular the increasing use of it by the state, something that I encounter a lot in my work on that is the prevalence of the idea of these technologies as objective and infallible, and the obvious phenomenon of automation bias. From a cultural perspective, given your work, how do you suggest we sort of tackle and deconstruct this idea that automated decision-making de-risks decisions and makes them objective and infallible?
Well, this is the impulse right now in the kind of fairness, accountability, transparency, ethics movement around technology, which I think has defanged in many ways the powerful critiques of how capital and power are working in our lives to arguments that we can build a perfect algorithm that's unbiased, right? So it's still a techno-deterministic point of view that we just perfect the algorithms rather than calling into question whether an algorithm should make decisions of a social nature, of a political nature, right? Should an algorithm, decide that I'm going to be gunned down by a drone? Who's responsible then, right? I mean, these kinds of questions are really important, and I think we have to notice and speak to these impulses about perfecting the penultimate AI or set of algorithms, because we don't have time to go into it, but of course we know, for example, that the data that algorithms and AI or machine learning is engaging in, like data from this incredible building, it's fraught with all of the kinds of things that have already been brought out, right? And so that is not going to necessarily be legible to a programmer or a team of programmers, or legible in kind of, again, encoding some of the worst of the past and bringing that into the future in an automated way that makes it obscure and opaque and difficult to see, which is one of the things that I feel incredibly concerned about, which is the data that's used for machine learning. And those of us who work with data know that data is also socially constructed, and we should remind people that data isn't just data. Data is made, and it's laden with power, and we need to be able to recognize in whose interest and who loses in some of these propositions. And this is, again, why I think we have to always center the vulnerable, the weakest, the most oppressed in our societies, because we will ask different questions and we will see different possibilities.
Any more questions? I have a last one, picking up on that point.
I almost said thank you, good night. I'm not
Which,
good. One more.
You speak incredibly powerfully about the impact of capital and property rights. And I'm reflecting on the work of the archivist and these questions of bias, particularly as we start to use more algorithmic decisions for selecting evidence for long-term preservation. Where do you see the rights of the future in all of this, which is one of the things that we automatically find ourselves thinking quite a lot about?
That is the hardest question that he left for the end. I mean, one of the things that I think is happening with these automated systems is it's precluding a possibility for a wide open future. Because if we leave as we increasingly rely upon these systems, complex systems, I mean, even in something like Google search, you've got over 200 factors that are apart, according to Google. They have, a lot of people working on search, working on just that algorithm, let alone all the other kinds of technologies we're engaging with. There's a point at which it's quite difficult to even go in and tweak something, right, or fix something. And I think that the embeddedness of these technologies is becoming so ubiquitous that it will foreclose certain possibilities about agency, right? And that humans should decide. I'm betting that at some point in the future we will start saying things like, why can't humans decide? Instead of the machines, or why, or it's kind of like, when I go to buy something and the cash register goes down and the person can't make change for me by hand because they need the screen to tell them. Do you know, it's like it truncates in that one transaction the possibilities to just keep moving on, do you know, because we're limited by, everybody knows this, like when they go to the airport, or you're trying to, so all of these kinds of systems, on one level, they are particular kinds of efficiencies for some, for companies, for the state. I'm not sure they create more efficiencies and possibilities for us the more we become reliant upon them. And, you know, Shoshana Zuboff has this new book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, that if you think my talk upset you, I had to put it down and walk away for a minute. It was very powerful. And one of the things she argues is that our deep engagements with these technologies are actually just consumer behavior manipulation. And we will not even know what could be possible or what's available because we will only be in the purview of what is coming at us to manipulate us to make certain kinds of choices. And we're already in that moment, of course. And, you know, she forecasts a very kind of dark future about where these technologies are going, and I think she's right. And so I think this is where, you know, we should not, I don't know, I end up upsetting a lot of people when I say, like, maybe we shouldn't digitize everything. Maybe we should create, like, our value as human beings. That, like, I just read it, I saw a website tonight that was so amazing where they said their slogan was that being human is the differentiating value. I think that's something that's worth holding on to.
It's an amazing point to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So we've got poster presentation and drinks, which are out this way. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along.